Hutton.
Jungle Book is a lasting gem in the Disney crown.
Have a banana.
It had a sense of perfection within itself.
Story and strong characters.
You want to know something? We're good sparring partners.
I had no idea, I'm sure he didn't either, that this was going to be the last animated film he'd ever make. It just embodied so many of the beliefs and the feelings that Walt wanted to imbue to the people. He poured himself into every sequence.
Hey!
It would be impossible not to look at Jungle Book and say, yes, of course, you can see it's got Walt's fingerprints all over it.
I think Walt had that genius of being his own best audience, and then a genius in executing his vision of what this medium could do. He was inspiring a group of artists never done it before.
Walt attracted strong personalities, great talents, and individualists like Bill Peet.
Bill Peet's one of the greatest story men that ever lived, someone who Walt had leaned on towards the end when his attention was being split by the parks and all of the things that Disney was getting into.
He had worked there since the 1930s, and he was really Walt's ace story man.
His fingerprints are all over all the Disney classics as a story man from pretty much Pinocchio on.
He had a sense of structure that was very helpful in an animated film.
Whenever there was a story problem, Walt would take it to Bill Peet.
I'm sorry, but I need your help. I was taking...
As Walt developed other interests in Disneyland and live-action pictures, Bill Peet's skill in developing animated story actually freed him up to do other things.
Bill Peet single-handedly storyboarded 101 Dalmatians.
It wasn't done that way. Disney never had one person do the screenplay.
When they delivered the script, Disney said, great, go make it. And he really kept his hands off that film through the story process.
So Disney allowed him to do Sword in the Stone, do the same thing with that. And then it was actually Bill Peet who proposed the Jungle Book to Walt Disney. He said we could do more interesting animal characters.
Once Walt gave Bill the okay to start adapting Jungle Book from Kipling, Pete took the film in his own direction, as he usually did.
He read and read and reread the Jungle Book, and he began to come up with story sketches. And he showed them to Walt, and Walt liked them.
I had spent a lot of time going upstairs to the third floor to look at Bill Peet's storyboards. And I confess, the story that Bill was working on had me intrigued. I thought Bill was doing a fantastic job.
The Sword in the Stone, you know, that wasn't very well received.
Walt became a little bit more critical toward Bill Peet after Sword in the Stone.
He wanted to get much more involved in story than he had been in the previous couple, and he got all over Jungle Book.
There was also an additional problem. By the time that Walt headed in to the Jungle Book, he had reduced the whole animation operation so that there was a master animator who was the head of the entire operation, and that was Willie Reitherman. There was a single art director, Ken Anderson, and there were 4 supervising animators, Ollie Johnston, Frank Thomas, Milt Kahl, and John Lounsbury, all of whom were members of the famous 9 Old Men. And then there was 1 story man. And in the case of the Jungle Book, Bill Peet was really the story man. So it was Bill Peet's responsibility to devise the storyboards, to get the voices to be recorded, to record those voices. As Bill Peet himself once said, there were 40 people who were assigned to these jobs in the golden age of Disney animation. Now they were all being performed by 1 man, me, Bill Peet.
Bob and I had been staff writers at the studio for approximately 5 years by that time. And one day Walt called us in and said, I don't like the way Jungle Book is going. Bill Peet had written a very sincere version of Rudyard Kipling's telling.
He saw a film taking shape that was initially not the kind of film that he wanted to see. It was very dark, it was very brooding, it wasn't the kind of film that he'd envisaged being made of Kipling's stories.
Walt and Bill couldn't seem to reach agreement on the film's development, and the two of them, after all those years, broke up. Pete left the studio and never returned.
After Bill Peet left, Larry Clements was given the job of putting together the story.
Well, when he put me on Jungle Book, that was my first writing on an animated cartoon feature.
Well, we were at this meeting, and the first thing Walt said, I remember, how many fellas have read the original Jungle Book story by Rudyard Kipling?
And no script pages, but from an outline by our writer, Larry Clemens.
Walt didn't want to read things. He'd rather see storyboard sketches. It was visual, you could see it, you could see the action.
The whole idea of being a Disney story artist is that you're supposed to be able to take a bare bones outline and develop the character, add whatever entertainment value you can.
Walt liked people around him that were willing to try and dare, even though they didn't know quite where they were going or why even. But most of all, he stressed personality.
You better believe it, and I'm loaded with both.
When Walt Disney visited a project, he changed the project. And perhaps the most dramatic way in which he changed the project was with Phil Harris.
We went through a lot of bears before we got Phil, and none of them seemed to be right. And finally, Walt says, "Why don't you try Phil Harris?" And of course, some of the animators said, "Phil Harris in a Rudyard Kipling film?" And Walt says, "Why not? We're going to make our own Jungle Book, and we'll do it our way."
You better believe it.
Once Walt had heard the audition, Walt went bananas. He loved it. It was one of those things that kind of triggered things in Walt and got him excited.
Walt cared most about entertainment, and I think it shows in how the story was worked out.
We'd start with the main sequence in the middle of the picture, not the beginning, where all the main characters in it. We'd learn our characters, and then from there we'd expand either way.
Nice footage that flowed and was very entertaining, but we had no tiger in the picture yet.
The tiger? Sooner or later, Mowgli will meet Shere Khan.
I suggested to Walt in this meeting, don't you think this is a good time to just get an outline here so we know where we're heading?
Walt said, "You guys don't worry about that icky, sticky story stuff. You leave that to me."
He wanted to get in closer on the characters. The story, the plot was of secondary importance to him. Jungle Book was very difficult for me to work on. I just never knew where I was or what was going on.
Nobody knew at that certain point how to finish the storyline because the relationship...
One meeting, apparently, Walt said, well, why not have the little girl from the village entice Mowgli? Ollie Johnston, who was supposed to animate that, was appalled. He thought that was a terrible ending.
Ollie was telling later on, and the more he thought about it, the way he would do it, the more he really got into it and found a really sensitive way of doing that. You know, it's very casual and I don't want to say tasteful.
And that's the love story. It's a little tenderness, a little sweetness, and also the bittersweet idea of the fact that Baloo really wants the boy to come with him, but he and Bagheera go off together.
The Kipling book is very dark and very mysterious and a terrific book. But I think Walt was very, very canny in wanting to go a completely different direction with it.
It's possibly, I think, the most bright and breezy, freewheeling, happy-go-lucky, upbeat of all Disney's movies.
It bears very little resemblance to the original Rudyard Kipling, but I don't think that's what Walt wanted. Walt always wanted things that had characters in them that engaged the audience. And
I don't think that there's ever been a better showcase for character animation.
One of the things Walt Disney always remarked over and over again in story meetings was, we've got some great characters here, we've got some great personalities. I want you guys to take advantage. And I recall Walt's words, he said, "Give me some good stuff."
A lot of putting personality into animated characters comes from the design, obviously. And they had Ken Anderson on the Jungle Book, who did these incredible first-pass sketches at the designs for these characters.
Ken Anderson started out as a trained architect, came to the studio in the 1930s, got some difficult assignments. There's the three little kittens. There's a scene where they're running through a room, and he animated this entire floor, turning in perspective. It's an enormously difficult assignment. Whenever they started on a project, they would go to Ken to come up with some ideas for character designs and props, settings.
Ken was just a master at coming up with a quick statement that read a certain kind of personality. There's a drawing that he did of Shere Khan where he just looks incredibly haughty and he's got this nose stuck up in the air and his chin sticking out.
Could it be possible that you don't know who I am?
Jungle Book came at a very interesting point in the evolution of animation at Disney. Walt, in some ways, knighted a group of artists, all at the ultimate pinnacle of their career. Woolie Reitherman, who was also one of Walt's 9 old men, was the director. He was this very weathered pilot who was also an animator and then went into the service during World War II.
Woolie had been a transport pilot in the China, Burma, India theater. He'd seen action. He'd led a life of command as far as Walt was concerned.
I think the animators always respected me up to a point. Boy, you know, with the large talents that were there, it wasn't easy to get respect.
Woolie knew that he was dealing with people who knew that they were the best in what they did, and he had to deal with them.
They would work closely together with one another. Frank and Ollie certainly worked the closest. And then there was, I think, Milt maybe a little bit proving his own worth out there. And there was, I think, like a healthy competition sometimes between these animators.
Milt Kahl is all over this movie in every possible way, and he is really the animator's animator. His draftsmanship is brilliant. I've been through the Disney Animation Research Library looking for a bad Milt Kahl drawing, and I have yet to see one. They don't exist. I give up. The guy was flawless.
Milt Kahl was doing a lot of animation on all the characters to sort of set them up. And then it would pass it off to the other animators. Say, okay, this is it. Now go do it.
This is just a little example of how you can see how they work together. This is from a scene by Frank Thomas. And then it's pretty loose. Not all the details are worked out. So Frank asked Milt to help him out with it. And when you line them up, you can see how sensitively Milt really helped him with that upshot. And the anatomy overall made him a little wider. But I love doing this because you can see the teamwork in something like this.
I'm talking about like a big bear.
And then there was John Lounsbury. John Lounsbury did the elephants. He had a great animator helping him, Eric Cleworth, who never gets a lot of credit, but Eric Cleworth also did some beautiful scenes.
I think, in a way, the heart of the film rests on the work of two animators, which is Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, because together, Frank and Ollie, two best friends themselves, had worked with Disney for many years.
They animated roughly half the movie between the two of them over the course of a very short span of time.
Even their name is like one name, Frank and Ollie, and their offices were right next to each other. You would always see them in each other's office talking about an idea.
These drawings follow the section here where
that looks good.
he's got
Hey,
these
yeah,
actions.
he's hopping up and down.
I
Yeah.
said, keep it loose now. Keep it real loose.
It seemed like they developed this way of thinking that really went back all the way to when they started here at the studio.
The two of them met when they were 19 years old. And Frank had grown up in Fresno, which was pretty much a farming town at the time. And Ollie had grown up on the Stanford University campus, where his father was a professor there. But Frank's father was a college professor as well. So you had two young guys with more or less similar family backgrounds. They're both interested in art. They both came down to Los Angeles to go to art school. The next thing you know, there's an opportunity to take a tryout at Disney.
I put both Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston in little cameos in both of my first two films.
Hey, you see that? Yeah, that's the way to do it. That's old school. Yeah? No school like the old school.
They're brilliant animators, both of them. You get the feeling that they were constantly kind of showing each other their stuff and getting the other's take on a scene.
Here were two guys who were involved with some of the most remarkable animated films that have ever been made.
I mean, you go back to Frank doing the ice skating scene in Bambi and the spaghetti eating scene in Lady and the Tramp.
Milt Kahl mentioned to Ollie Around the time that they were doing Sleeping Beauty, he said, you know, you and Frank have got something unusual, the way you can talk to each other about stuff.
They always trusted each other. I think the feeling of trust is something that pervades the Jungle Book in terms of the character of Mowgli.
Here, the characters could be shaped around the voice.
Walt actually cast Phil Harris as Baloo because Walt knew him socially. Well, Phil Harris was married to Alice Faye, and they used to go to parties. And one day he said, I want him to be Baloo. And this was a shocking thing. How could Phil Harris, you know, a Dixieland jazz musician, you know, wisecracking guy, the sidekick of Jack Benny, how could he be a Kipling character?
Even Harris himself apparently, thought Walt was crazy. Like, what am I going to do? I don't do this.
So I got up and I started to read this thing, and I got about about 2 or 3 lines, and I looked over at Willie Wrightham, and I said, I can't do it. It just doesn't feel natural.
You know, it ain't easy learning to be like me.
They said, well, Phil, what do you suggest? I don't know what made me say it. I said, well, do you mind if I do it the way I would do it? And they said, go ahead and try it. I said, look, kid, you keep fooling around in here with these animals, right? That monkey will eat you, you get your roof knocked in. Ooh.
A lot of the things that are in the film are things that Harris came up with. No, the scriptwriters or the storymen did not come up with. Harris would have improvised this right on the stage.
And the animators suddenly had new life in the project. Ollie Johnson said to me that when Walt decided that Phil Harris was going to do the voice for Baloo, and they knew that they had a character that really worked, he said that was the turning point.
That is one of the greatest characters that Disney animation has ever done.
Book, but my favorite, it's got to be I Want to Be Like You. I just love that.
We figured that Louis Prima would be the ideal character. And so we went to Las Vegas, played the song for Louis and the boys. They loved it.
So we had Louis Prima, Sam Butera and the Witnesses, and then Phil Harris comes in and he does his business. It was just special.
Well, I recall the day Prima and his band came to the Disney studio to record that wonderful King Louis song, I Want to Be Like You. We had our own recording stages. And so Prima's band was there, and it was just a little too wild and crazy for Disney. But boy, we heard those tracks, and they just knocked us out. Prima recorded the stuff by himself because Phil Harris wasn't able to make that session.
Sam Butera did the voice of that Baloo was going to do, and Louis Prima had the spot where he goes Scooby-Dooby-Doo. He did that little spot there where he goes Scooby-Dooby-Doo, and then Sam Butera would say Scooby-Dooby-Doo, a-dee-ba-da-ba-da, a-dee-ba-da-ba-da, a-do-ba-do-ba-do. It was just aping back and forth. And when Phil Harris heard this temporary recording, he said, I don't sing like that. That's none of my words. I don't that kind of. So he was getting excited. He said, well, just let me hear Louis, and I'll do my answers. So you heard Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Nobody at the studio was aware that Walt was as sick as he was.
He'd had a neck pain, and he went in to have that examined because he suspected it might be a pinched nerve.
We knew that he was going into the hospital, and we thought it was about an old polo injury he'd had in his neck. And so we asked him if he was worried about it, and he says, "You're darn right I am."
When diagnostic tests were done, they discovered that he had lung cancer.
Walt was like a father figure to everybody. You just don't think father's ever going to get sick or ever certainly going to die.
In between that period of November and December 15th, he kind of summoned his strength and came back to pay that one last visit to the studio.
Everybody was kind of perked up. Gee, Walt's feeling better, that's good.
I was so grateful and glad to see him. I said, gee, it's good to see you, Walt. He said, Ken, it's sure good to be here.
He was very thin and gaunt and grayed. I realized he's much sicker than I imagined.
He came into my office and sat down. He just wanted to talk. Matter of fact, in that chair in there, as a matter of fact. And then he walked down the hall and said goodbye. He never said goodbye to anybody in his life. Well, I'll see you next week or something.
And then he asked to be driven home because he no longer had the energy.
And that was the last anybody ever saw. Then it wasn't more than another week that we came to work, and about 9:30, I remember it so clearly. Ollie came in with tears in his eyes and he says, Walt's dead.
People dealt with it in their own way. Some were in tears, some just packed up their stuff and went home. Others just sat at their desks silently.
All the animators were coming in. Milt and Frank, they were devastated. What are we going to do?
I believe that Walt never ever gave it a thought that what if would happen to this wonderful thing if I passed on. I don't think he ever thought of that.
In some ways, Walt's death forced each one of them to become the mature animators that they were by that point. The mantle of animation was really placed on their shoulders.
There was an afternoon late in the course of Walt's illness when his end was imminent that he called my dad over to the hospital and explained to him that he wanted my dad to take over as the person who would take the full-length feature animated programs forward at the studio. Wooly forged ahead and got the picture going, and everybody was behind him 100%.
This was survival as far as I was concerned, and most of the animators were concerned. It was survival to keep this thing going, this thing called Walt Disney Animation.
That was a good feeling, knowing that his last film would be completed the way Walt wanted it completed.
In February, we ran the picture, and a large group of the studio people were in to see the film. And Hazel George, the nurse, talked to me afterwards.
Walt's nurse was very close to Walt because Walt had an injury and he needed massages regularly after a long day and all that, so she usually knew what was going on in Walt's mind.
She had this way of talking about Walt. She said, Walt wasn't a man, he was a force of nature. And that last scene where Baloo and Bagheera...
A year later, in 1967, almost a year after his death, The Jungle Book was released. A new Disney film.
And it was kind of like Walt Disney's time-released posthumous Christmas gift to the kids of the world.
It was a big darn deal, and it was very popular.
Jungle Book was the first picture to make a lot of money. Everybody was so proud. This picture gave the company confidence in animation, which may have or may not have been wavering at the time.
Both Louis Prima and Phil Harris, with all the things that they've done in their careers, they both were quoted as saying, the one thing that gives me immortality will be the Walt Disney picture, Jungle Book.
Unfortunately, there wasn't a way for Bill Peet and Walt to mend their ways before Walt passed away. But when Bill Peet wrote his autobiography, some 20 years later, he had a lot of great and kind things to say about Walt.
The key to any Disney animated film has to be the heart. In that period of time, in the making of Jungle Book, Walt was driving it home to those guys. This is why we're doing what we do.
Jungle Book is a distillation of a long, rich friendship between Frank and Ollie, of a loving relationship between Wooly and his son Bruce. It's a distillation of the relationships of people in that studio, the lives they'd lived, the emotions they'd felt, and they found a vehicle that they could really express all these things through.
To me, it's very poetic that here at the end of his life, the last picture he worked on, it sort of came full circle of the fun that he had way back in the 30s, working on the shorts with the guys he had there. It may even have been the last story meeting that he had with the animators. He said to them, gee guys, I had forgotten how much fun